On the 31st of May, 1918, German forces were preparing for another massive offensive against French army positions during the Third Battle of the Aisne, and none of them could even imagine that in a few hours they would encounter a weapon that would completely change the perception of warfare for the next 100 years. When 30 small machines, a little taller than a human, began to crawl out of the morning fog, the German soldiers initially did not understand what these things even were. These iron boxes on tracks with rotating turrets seemed too small and strange. However, within a few minutes, when the machine guns and light cannons of these tiny monsters opened fire, and the machines themselves began methodically crushing barbed wire and overcoming trenches, entire units of the Kaiser's army began to surrender in a panic. This was the Renault FT tank, a machine weighing merely 7 tons that forever changed the face of war and became the great-grandfather of all modern tanks, from the American Abrams to the Russian T-90. To understand how revolutionary this small French machine was, one needs to go back several years and examine what was generally happening on the battlefields of the First World War by 1917. The Western Front was a continuous nightmare of mud, barbed wire, shell craters, and endless trenches, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border for several hundred kilometers. Any attempt at an offensive turned into a bloody massacre. Infantry emerging from the trenches to attack immediately came under withering enemy machine gun fire and suffered horrendous losses. 4 meters of recaptured territory were paid for with thousands of lives, and a week later the enemy could reclaim those same 4 meters, and everything would begin anew. The French army lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in fruitless offensives. The morale of the troops plummeted catastrophically, and in 1917, mass mutinies even occurred in several divisions, which refused to go into another suicidal attack. The British were the first to attempt to solve this problem technically, creating their famous rhomboidal Mark series tanks in 1916, which first went into battle on the 15th of September of that same year on the Somme River. These enormous steel monsters made an incredible impression with their size and ability to overcome obstacles, but they had a host of very serious drawbacks which severely limited their combat effectiveness. Firstly, they were terribly slow. Their maximum speed was about 6 kilometers per hour on a flat road and dropped to 3 to 4 kilometers on rough terrain. Secondly, an 8-person crew suffocated inside from the heat and exhaust fumes. Temperatures rose to 50 degrees, and after 1 to 1.5 hours of combat, people simply lost consciousness. Thirdly, operating this behemoth was incredibly difficult. It required 4 people just to steer the tank in the desired direction, and they had to work in perfect coordination. Fourthly, the cannons on these tanks were located in sponsons on the sides of the hull and could not rotate independently, which created huge dead zones in their firing arcs. The French also tried to create their own tanks, but the results were even worse than those of the British. The first French tank was the Schneider, which began to enter service in early 1917. This 13.5-ton machine was based on an American Holt tractor and looked like a long box on tracks with a short nose at the front. The armament consisted of a short-barreled 75mm cannon in the right sponson and 2 Hotchkiss machine guns of 8mm caliber. A crew of 6 men was accommodated in the cramped compartment where infernal heat prevailed, and the concentration of exhaust fumes was such that people regularly lost consciousness right in the middle of battle. But the most terrible drawback of the Schneider was its catastrophically low cross-country capability. The tank had a very high center of gravity and a short track base, which caused it to constantly get stuck in shell craters, overturn when crossing trenches, and generally behave extremely unpredictably on uneven terrain. The combat debut of the Schneider on the 16th of April, 1917, during the Nivelle Offensive, turned into a real catastrophe. Of the 132 tanks that went into attack, 57 were destroyed or crippled, and most of the others got stuck in the mud or craters. The second French tank was the Saint-Chamond, which was even more unsuccessful than the Schneider. This 23-ton machine was the heaviest tank of the First World War and represented simply a monstrous design. It had a long hull on the chassis of the same Holt tractor with an enormous front overhang where the 75mm cannon was located. The crew consisted of 9 men who were accommodated in the cramped compartment and practically choked from the heat and gases. The Saint-Chamond was armed better than other tanks of that time. In addition to the main cannon, it carried 4 machine guns of 8mm caliber, which made it a true mobile fortress. However, the cross-country capability of this monster was even worse than that of the Schneider. The long front overhang constantly dug into the ground when overcoming obstacles. The tank got stuck in trenches only 2 meters wide, overturned on the slightest slopes, and was generally completely unsuitable for operations on the crater-riddled terrain of the Western Front. In its first battle on the 5th of May, 1917, out of 16 Saint-Chamonds, 15 got stuck without passing 100 meters from the front line, and only 1 tank managed to reach the German positions. The French command perfectly understood that both of their tanks represented dead ends in development and that something fundamentally new needed to be created urgently. The chief ideologist of the French tank forces was General Jean-Baptiste Estienne, who even before the war was interested in the possibility of using armored vehicles on the battlefield and closely followed all experiments in this area. Estienne believed that tanks should not operate individually or in small groups, as the British practiced, but in massive formations, literally overwhelming the enemy with the sheer number of vehicles. However, to implement such tactics, cheap, easy-to-produce, and reliable tanks were needed, which could be manufactured by the thousands, not by the hundreds. The Schneider and Saint-Chamond were too complex, expensive, and unreliable for mass production. Therefore, Estienne began searching for a designer who could create a fundamentally new machine. Estienne's choice fell upon Louis Renault, the famous French automotive industrialist and designer, whose company, by the beginning of the war, was one of the largest car manufacturers in Europe. Renault became famous at the very end of the 19th century when, at the age of 21, he created his first car with direct drive to the rear axle via a gearbox, a solution that became the standard for the entire automotive industry. By 1917, Louis Renault was 39 years old. His factories were engaged in defense production, producing trucks, aircraft engines, and ammunition, and he himself was considered one of France's best engineers. However, Renault had never worked with tanks. He had absolutely no experience with tracked vehicles, and when Etienne approached him with a proposal to design a new light tank, many colleagues considered the undertaking a hopeless gamble. Etienne presented Renault with very clear requirements. The tank had to be light, no heavier than 8 tons, so that it could be transported by ordinary trucks and railway platforms. It had to be fast and maneuverable enough to break through the front line en masse and operate deep within enemy defenses. It had to be simple to manufacture and inexpensive, so that it could be produced by the thousands. It had to feature a rotating turret with armament to fire in any direction without having to turn the entire tank hull. And finally, it had to be reliable and capable of overcoming trenches, craters, and other battlefield obstacles. The task seemed impossible, as all existing tanks were enormous, slow, unreliable machines with fixed armament, and ATN was demanding their complete opposite. Renault accepted the challenge and plunged headfirst into working on the new project, which received the designation FT, an abbreviation from French meaning light tank. Renault approached the task as a true innovative engineer. He discarded all existing tank design concepts and began designing the machine from scratch, guided only by common sense and the laws of mechanics. The first revolutionary solution concerned the tank's layout. Renault placed the engine in the rear of the hull, the driving compartment in the front, and between them installed a rotating turret with armament and space for the commander-gunner. Such a layout seemed perfectly logical. The engine in the rear pushes the machine forward, the driver in the front sees the road and controls movement, and the commander in the turret has a panoramic view and can fire in any direction. However, before Renault, no one had thought of using precisely such a scheme, and it proved so successful that it became the standard for all subsequent tanks for an entire century to come. The second revolutionary solution was the rotating turret itself, which today seems a completely natural element of any tank, but in 1917 represented a true engineering puzzle. All existing tanks had cannons rigidly fixed in the hull or in side sponsons, which created enormous blind spots and forced the entire multi-ton machine to be turned to aim the gun at the target. Renault understood that for a light, maneuverable tank that had to operate deep within enemy defenses, surrounded by the enemy, the ability to fire in any direction was critically necessary. The problem was that the turret had to be light enough to be rotated manually by the strength of one man, but at the same time robust enough to withstand hits from bullets and shell fragments. He designed a cylindrical turret made of rolled armor steel, 22 millimeters thick, which was mounted on a ball-bearing support and could be rotated 360 degrees by the effort of the commander sitting inside. The design turned out surprisingly simple and reliable. No complex mechanisms, no hydraulic or electric drives, only high-quality mechanical processing of parts and precise fitting. The third ingenious discovery by Renault was the chassis design, featuring a distinctive rounded tail extension, which became the hallmark of the FT tank. This element did not appear for aesthetic reasons, nor was it accidental. It solved the critically important task of overcoming trenches that riddled the entire front line. Trenches of the first line of defense typically measured about 2.5 meters wide, and if a tank with a short track base attempted to cross them, its front part would fall into the trench, the tank would nose into the ground, and the rear would lift into the air, after which the machine would become irrevocably stuck and turn into an easy target. Renault extended the track base by means of the rounded tail, which touched the ground and prevented the tank's rear part from rising when traversing a trench. When the front part fell into the trench, the tail would brace against its far edge and serve as a support, allowing the tank to smoothly roll over the obstacle and continue moving. This simple and elegant solution worked flawlessly and allowed the FT to overcome trenches up to 1 meter 80 centimeters wide, which covered the absolute majority of trenches on the Western Front. The tank's track-based running gear consisted of 2 large-diameter drive wheels at the rear of the hull, to which power was transmitted from the engine, and smaller guiding wheels at the front, as well as 5 road wheels on each side. The tracks were relatively wide, ensuring good weight distribution of the vehicle across the surface, and allowing it to move over soft ground without sinking. The suspension was as simple as possible, rigid, without any shock absorbers, which made the ride inside the tank an extremely arduous ordeal for the crew, especially on rough terrain. However, such a design was reliable, inexpensive to produce, and practically maintenance-free, fully aligning with the concept of a mass-produced tank intended to be manufactured in thousands. As a power unit, Renault used its own design of a gasoline engine with a volume of 4.5 liters and featuring 4 cylinders, which developed 39 horsepower at 1,500 revolutions per minute. By modern standards, this seems laughable. 39 horsepower is barely enough for a scooter or a lawnmower, but in the context of 1917, it was quite respectable power for a machine weighing 7 tons. The engine was started either by an external crank handle, inserted through a special opening in the rear of the hull, or by an internal handle that the driver could use, although this was extremely awkward in the cramped control compartment. The fuel tank held 95 liters of gasoline, providing a range of about 48 kilometers on the highway or 30 kilometers on rough terrain. The transmission included a gearbox with 4 forward speeds and 1 reverse, giving the tank a maximum speed of 7 kilometers per hour on a flat road. The tank was controlled by a driver who sat in the front part of the hull and had extremely limited visibility through a small viewing slit. Turning was accomplished using 2 track brake control levers, a classic system employed on all tracked vehicles of that time and still in use today. By pulling the right lever, the driver would slow down the right track and the tank would turn right. Pulling the left lever would turn it left. For a sharp turn on the spot, one track had to be fully braked while applying throttle, whereupon the tank would pivot around the stationary track. The system was simple and reliable, although it required considerable physical effort from the driver, especially on heavy ground, where constant manipulation of the levers was necessary to adjust the direction of movement. The armament of the FT tank was presented in 2 variants, cannon and machine gun. The cannon variant carried a short-barreled Pitot cannon of 37 mm caliber, which was specially designed for installation in a tank turret and had a barrel length of only 21 calibers. This cannon did not boast a high muzzle velocity and was not very effective against armored targets, but it perfectly handled the destruction of machine gun nests, dugouts, creating passages and wire entanglements, and engaging enemy personnel with high explosive fragmentation shells. The ammunition load consisted of 237 rounds, which were placed in stows inside the turret and hull. The machine gun variant was armed with an 8 mm Hotchkiss machine gun, model 1914, with air cooling of the barrel, which was fed by rigid metal strips containing 24 rounds. The machine gun's ammunition load was 4,800 rounds, which ensured a sufficiently long engagement without reloading. The tank's crew consisted of only 2 men, a driver and a commander, who simultaneously performed the functions of gunner, loader, machine gunner, and observer. Such a minimal crew was possible due to the compact size of the vehicle and the simplicity of its design, but it placed an enormous burden on the commander, especially in combat. The commander had to rotate the turret, search for targets, aim the weapons, load them, open fire, monitor the situation, coordinate the driver's actions, and make tactical decisions, all simultaneously in a cramped, stuffy turret under enemy fire. The driver also did not have an easy life. Operating the tank required constant physical effort. Visibility was minimal. The noise of the engine and transmission was deafening, and exhaust gases seeped into the driving compartment. And when moving over rough terrain, the tank shook so much that the driver constantly hit his head against the hull walls, even while wearing a leather helmet. The armor protection of the FT tank was differentiated. The frontal hull had a thickness of 16 millimeters, the sides and rear 8 millimeters, and the roof and bottom 6 millimeters. The turret was protected by armor 22 millimeters thick at the front and 16 millimeters on the sides and rear. Such protection was sufficient against rifle and machine gun bullets at all ranges, as well as against shell fragments, but it could not withstand a direct hit from an artillery shell, even of small caliber, or a shot from an anti-tank rifle, which began to appear among the Germans by the end of 1917. However, Renault did not count on anti-shell armor. It would have made the tank too heavy and expensive, and the concept of FT's deployment envisaged a breakthrough deep into enemy defenses where tanks were intended to operate against infantry and unarmored targets, avoiding encounters with artillery. The first prototype of the FT tank was ready by the end of February 1907, which in itself was an incredible achievement. From the start of design to the production of a running prototype, only a few months passed. On February 22nd, the prototype was demonstrated to a military commission at a testing ground in Champagne, and the test results exceeded all expectations. The small tank easily overcame trenches, shell craters, wire entanglements, and moved across mud and slopes, demonstrating maneuverability and off-road capability unavailable to heavy tanks. General Etienne was delighted and immediately demanded the start of mass production and in the largest possible quantities. However, skeptics in the War Ministry doubted that such a small machine could be effective on the battlefield and insisted on additional tests and design refinements. Renault continued to perfect his tank throughout the spring and summer of 1917, eliminating identified shortcomings and improving the reliability of its components and assemblies. Changes were made to the transmission design, the suspension was strengthened, the engine cooling system was improved, and the turret design and its rotation mechanism were refined. By the autumn of 1917, the tank's design had been finalized, and preparations for mass production began at the Renault factories and several other French enterprises. The French command planned to receive the first batch of 3,500 tanks by the spring of 1918, which would enable a large-scale offensive using the new equipment and turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. Production of FT tanks began in late 1917 at several factories simultaneously, including Renault's own enterprises, the Berliet factories in Lyon, and the Samoy factories in Saint-Chamond. The manufacturing technology was simplified to the greatest extent possible. Armor plates were cut with guillotine shears and assembled on a frame using riveting, which did not require highly skilled workers and allowed for rapid increases in production volume. Engines and transmissions were manufactured at Renault automobile factories using already proven technologies. Tracks and road wheels were ordered from metallurgical enterprises. Turrets were stamped at artillery factories. By the spring of 1918, production had reached full capacity, and tanks began arriving in the troops by the tens each week. The French command formed special tank companies, each with 20 vehicles, which were intended to operate in conjunction with infantry units and support them with fire and maneuver. Crew training was conducted at a specially established tank proving ground in Champlain, where drivers and commanders learned to operate the vehicles, fire cannons and machine guns, overcome obstacles, and coordinate with infantry. Crew preparation took from 2 to 4 weeks, which was significantly faster than training pilots or artillerymen. Many tankmen were recruited from mechanics and truck drivers who already had experience working with engines and transmissions, which considerably accelerated the training process. By May of 1918, the French Army possessed several hundred combat-ready FT tanks and trained crews prepared for combat deployment. The first 30 tanks went into attack in the forest near the village of Villers-Cotterêts, where German forces were attempting to develop their spring offensive and break through to Paris. The French command decided to use the new machines for a counterattack, which was intended to halt the enemy's advance and stabilize the front. The tanks moved to their starting positions early in the morning amidst a thick fog which concealed them from enemy observation. As the fog began to dissipate, 30 small machines simultaneously advanced in a wide chain, crushing barbed wire and firing cannons and machine guns at the German trenches. German infantry opened return fire with rifles and machine guns, but the bullets ricocheted off the armor plates, causing no harm to the tanks. Several anti-tank guns opened direct fire, but the tanks maneuvered quickly, changing direction, and the gun crews did not have time to aim. The psychological effect of the tank's appearance exceeded all expectations of the French command. Soldiers, exhausted by 4 years of trench warfare and accustomed to artillery fire and machine guns posing the primary danger, were completely unprepared to encounter armored vehicles which ruthlessly crushed their fortifications and fired into their trenches at point-blank range. Many German units began to retreat without engaging, and some even surrendered in entire platoons at the mere sight of approaching tanks. French infantry, advancing behind the tanks, suffered minimal losses and quickly pushed forward, capturing one position after another. By the end of the day, the German offensive was completely halted, and in some sectors the enemy was pushed back by several kilometers. The success of the first combat deployment of FT tanks convinced the French command of the correctness of their chosen concept for the mass use of light tanks. General Pétain, who by then had become Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, ordered an increase in tank production to the maximum possible level and the formation of as many tank companies as possible for the upcoming summer offensive. By July 1918, the French Army already possessed more than 300 FT tanks, and they were actively employed in all major operations on the Western Front. The American Army, having landed in France in large numbers by the summer of 1918, had no tanks of its own and was entirely dependent on French supplies of armored vehicles. The French command handed over 144 FT tanks to the Americans, on the basis of which the first American tank units were formed. Command of these units was entrusted to 32-year-old Captain George Smith Patton, Jr., a cavalry officer who had never before dealt with armored vehicles, but showed immense enthusiasm and interest in this new type of weapon. Patton personally traveled to France to the tank proving ground in Champlou, where for several weeks he studied the design of the tanks, the fundamentals of their operation, and their tactical deployment, after which he began to form and train American tank crews. Patton proved to be a born tanker and quickly grasped all the advantages and disadvantages of the FT machines. He developed his own tank deployment tactics, which included close cooperation with infantry, rapid penetration deep into enemy defenses, and immediate exploitation of success without halts or regrouping. Patton personally participated in training the crews, driving tanks, firing cannons, overcoming obstacles, and demanded maximum effort and aggressiveness in combat from his subordinates. His first baptism of fire took place on September 12, 1918, during the offensive on the Saint-Chamond salient, where American forces, supported by French units, attacked German positions along a front sector approximately 30 kilometers long. Patton personally led the attack of his tanks, moving ahead of the combat formations on foot with a cane in his hand under enemy fire, showing the crews the direction of movement and encouraging them with shouts and gestures. When several tanks became stuck in shell craters and trenches, Patton organized their evacuation, personally directing the operations under machine gun fire. American tanks successfully broke through the first line of German defenses, destroyed several machine gun nests, and created passages in the wire entanglements, which allowed the infantry to advance with minimal losses. For this battle, Patton was awarded the highest American award for bravery and received the rank of lieutenant colonel, and his tank brigade became one of the most effective units of the American Expeditionary Forces. The 100-day offensive of the Allies, which began on August the 8th, 1918, marked the finest hour for the FT tanks. By this time, the French Army already possessed more than 3,000 tanks, which had been organized into special tank battalions and brigades. The massive deployment of tanks along the entire front, from the North Sea to Verdun, led to the complete collapse of the German defense. The tanks broke through trench lines, destroyed strong points, crushed artillery batteries, and sowed panic in the enemy's rear. The German army, exhausted by 4 years of war and devoid of reserves, could not withstand such an onslaught and retreated eastward, abandoning one position after another. Over 100 days, the Allies advanced hundreds of kilometers, liberated all occupied territory in France and Belgium, and reached the German border. Impressed by the success of the French tanks, the American command decided to establish its own licensed production of the FT. A contract was signed with the Van Dorn Iron Works Company, which was supposed to produce 4,400 tanks. Production began in the autumn of 1918, but progressed slowly due to technical difficulties and a lack of experience among American engineers. By November, only 952 vehicles had been manufactured, and none of them managed to reach the front before the war ended on November the 11th. Following the end of the First World War, France found itself in possession of a vast surplus of FT tanks, which were no longer needed in such quantities. The French government initiated an active program to export its surplus armored vehicles to various countries around the world. And so, FT tanks spread across all continents. Poland purchased several hundred vehicles and successfully employed them in the war against Soviet Russia in 1920. Finland received 32 tanks and used them against the Red Army. Romania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, China, Japan, and even Brazil. All these countries operated French tanks at different times. Some states not only purchased ready-made vehicles, but also organized their own licensed production, as Italy did, producing about 100 tanks under the designation Fiat 3000. FT tanks participated in virtually all major and minor military conflicts of the interwar period. During the Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1939, both sides of the conflict used these vehicles, although by then they were hopelessly obsolete and could not stand against more modern Soviet T-26 and German Panzer I tanks. In China, FT tanks were employed in battles against Japanese forces, but with minimal success due to the technical wear and tear of the vehicles and the lack of spare parts. By the beginning of the Second World War, FT tanks were still in service with several European armies, including Poland, Romania, and France itself, which used them as training vehicles and for guarding rear facilities. When the German Army began its offensive in the West in May 1940, several dozens of old FT tanks were thrown into battle in a desperate attempt to halt the enemy's advance. The crews of these vehicles displayed incredible courage, attacking modern German tanks and anti-tank guns with hopelessly obsolete machinery. The outcome was predictable. Virtually all the tanks were destroyed or captured in the very first days of fighting, and their crews were killed or taken prisoner. German forces captured several hundreds of serviceable FT tanks and used them to guard airfields, railway stations, and other rear echelon facilities in the occupied territories. Some of these vehicles were converted into self-propelled artillery pieces or armored personnel carriers. The last instances of the FT tank's combat deployment date back to 1944 to 45, when individual vehicles were utilized by partisans and resistance forces in various European countries. Thus ended the combat service of a tank that changed the face of war and became the foundation for all subsequent development of armored fighting vehicles. The small 7-ton FT lived an incredibly long life for a combat vehicle, nearly 30 years from its first battle to its last shot. If you enjoyed this story about a legendary tank that was a century ahead of its time, be sure to like this video. Write in the comments about what other military equipment you would like to learn about. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new, fascinating stories about machines that changed the world.